Hello, my name is Jenna Travers, and today I'll be presenting on my thesis research, Stories of Decline, Glacier Retreat, and Salmon Shortages in Washington. So I am a researcher in the Glacier lab at UO, and a lot of my research focuses on glacier retreat and salmon declines. And so right now we know that climate change is causing glaciers to retreat at a rapid pace in Washington and around the world. The Lillian Glacier, as shown on the right, has retreated at an immense amount over the past century, and it's not alone. In the past 40 years alone, 35 glaciers have disappeared entirely in the Olympic National Park. At the same time, salmon populations are really struggling in Washington. So 14 populations as of 2020 were listed as either endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act in Washington, and 5 of those were deemed in crisis. So they are at a point where if we don't do something now, they are going to go extinct. And these two things are connected. So glaciers provide cold meltwater for salmon in streams during hot summer months when rain is not available because of droughts and all the snowpack has already melted due to the heat. And so they're really important for essentially being a reservoir and acting as a water supply to help these spawning salmon, help juvenile salmon that are in streams, and all of that. And so my research looks at the species-based impacts. So how will different species of salmon be impacted differently by glaciers just based on their location, how much time they spend in streams, and their life history. I also look at the societal impacts of glacier retreat and salmon decline. So how will losing glaciers, how will losing salmon affect communities, especially looking at economic impacts, ecological impacts, and cultural impacts. And then finally, and what my thesis is about, I look at the science communication surrounding glacier retreat and salmon declines. So we know that the way that issues are talked about affects perceptions and policies and climate action. And so understanding how these issues are being communicated is really important, especially because these are an example of overlapping climate emergencies. And so essentially, these two issues are two climate issues happening in the same place affecting similar people. And that is going to change the way that narratives are told. So my thesis asked two main questions. How do narratives and stories of glacier retreat and salmon change based on who is telling them? So based on stakeholder. And then also, how are narratives of glacier retreat and salmon declines different than narratives of just glacier retreat or narratives of just salmon decline? So does that overlapping issue change these things at all? And there is a lot of literature on this, but there are also a lot of gaps. So we know that glacier retreat is going to impact different populations of salmon differently. In general, glacier retreat will lead to warmer streams and less water for salmon. But for salmon that don't spend as much time in streams, this isn't as big of an issue. For salmon that are in more northern areas, glacier retreat will open up more habitat, and they don't have as many issues with the warmer stream temperatures. So there aren't really those same detrimental effects. And so because glacier retreat is going to impact salmon populations differently, perceptions and narratives vary widely. And a lot of times policies that are suggested in these studies don't really consider public opinion and how different perceptions of this could change support for certain policies that are suggested in these papers. And then leading into that, the narratives we know are really important for climate change, and public perceptions support or opposition for policies and climate action. So we know that the way these stories are told, the way risks are framed, will be really impactful in understanding whether or not people support policies, whether they oppose them, and whether or not they get involved in climate action. However, there's really little research on how narratives are created, how they are shaped, and how they diverge from one another. And so we know that narratives are not always the same. You know, someone in the hydropower industry talks about glacier retreat in a different way than someone in the fisheries industry or someone in an indigenous community. But we don't actually know where that divergence comes from exactly and what causes it. And there's very little research on narratives of salmon decline, for instance, while there is a lot of research on narratives of ice loss. And so most of the research we found focuses on the more doom and gloom climate problems, like glaciers are retreating, and there's not a ton we can do about that. rather than focusing on narratives of things like salmon declines, where there are active measures we can take to fix that. And so that's another issue with this, is just that those overlapping emergencies have not been studied. So most of the research on climate narratives have looked only at one issue and have not really considered that overlapping problems are going to become more and more common as climate change worsens. And so I am hoping to fill those gaps with this research. So what I did for my project, I found 115 sources from 4 stakeholder groups. These 4 groups were chosen and identified because they are the most vocal about the issues of both glacier retreat and salmon declines, and they're also the most publicly accessible. So I did not include academia in this because the general public is not reading a 20-page academic article or a 200-page report on salmon declines at glacier retreat. So instead, I really focused on like articles and newsletters, videos, that sort of thing that were publicly accessible materials. And so those came from government sources, news outlets, environmental nonprofits, and indigenous tribes and tribal organizations. And so I read through each of these, I took notes on the narratives, and I compiled these lists into a codebook of common narratives. And so you can see a little bit of that on the right. Codes or narratives included things like glacier retreat is harming or will harm salmon, salmon are important and loss will be felt economically, and glaciers are retreating quickly in the Pacific Northwest. And so these codes I could then plug into Dedoose, which is a qualitative social science software, and apply them back. So I would go back through each of the articles, I would highlight certain areas of the text that like related to one of these narratives, and then I would code that in. And so then I was able to quantitatively analyze where these codes were appearing, how often certain narratives were used, and who was using which narratives. And so I was focusing on stakeholder, and I thought that this was going to be this really big discovery that stakeholder would have the biggest impact. And what I found was honestly not that much. There are some trends. So in the top left, in the importance of glaciers, media was the most likely to talk about importance of glaciers in almost all categories. In future action, government and indigenous sources were the most likely to talk about what is currently being done, which is really important for inspiring hope. And then in solutions and strategies, there was a general shift toward collaboration and co-production rather than education and communication, which is really interesting in terms of science communication, because there's been a lot of documentation that co-production models and collaboration models are much more effective for climate action than education or communication. But I didn't actually see these like huge trends that I was expecting to see. However, when I looked at glacier retreat impacts on salmon, I noticed that while most groups talked, or all of the groups talked about glacier retreat harms for salmon, indigenous groups were the only ones that didn't ever talk about benefits or mixed results for salmon. And I thought this was really interesting because glacier retreat will benefit certain populations of salmon. As I discussed, most likely they will benefit the more northern populations where salmon are not really in danger of having warming streams since it's colder, but the glaciers will retreat and leave behind new habitat. And so I thought it was really interesting that indigenous groups didn't have that and didn't talk about that. And so I thought maybe since that's a geographic location type of issue, maybe it has to do with geography. And so I looked at in-state versus out-of-state, and I realized that each of the other groups, government, environmental nonprofits, and news outlets, all have some sort of national or federal or international form to them. But indigenous groups were all local, and were all within the state of Washington, or at least based on watersheds that connected to Washington. And so I looked at this and I found some really clear differences. So first, in-state sources almost never talked about the benefits or mixed results that glacier retreat might have for salmon. So this is really important because the narratives that are happening within the state of Washington are very different than those that are happening outside of the state of Washington. And in addition, in terms of future action, in-state sources were much more likely to talk about future action. So while the out-of-state sources talked about how glacier retreat would impact salmon, how it was important, all of that, they really didn't focus that much on what could be done, future strategies, anything like that. And so a couple reasons why this could be. First of all, in-state and out-of-state are targeting different audiences. So the New York Times, when they are talking to a audience in Tampa, Florida, aren't going to give a step-by-step instruction of how to go restore salmon streams. They don't have the same audience as the Peninsula Daily News in Washington, who can tell their audience about what's currently being done, how they can get involved, all of that. And so part of this is just a different audience. And another part of it is different priorities. Out-of-state sources tend to be looking more to educate people on these issues and tell them about the problems, tell them about what's currently happening, whereas in-state sources are actively trying to work on these issues. And we see that as well in policies, where a lot of the local and state policies have been a lot more effective at protecting salmon, whereas the federal policies tend to be either a little more broad or the more specific ones don't pass. And so this is really important for understanding differences in narratives. Additionally, the second main question I asked is, how do overlapping narratives differ from single emergency narratives? And what I found is that when we just look at narratives of glacier retreat, so just the single one, they really are hopeless. Glaciers are retreating, it's going to hurt communities. There's very little future action, as you can see in the blue on the right. And that's just because even if we stopped emitting all carbon right now, glaciers would continue to retreat because temperatures will rise about another degree. And so there's really not anything that we can actively do to stop all glacier retreat. But with salmon declines, they're a lot more actionable. So salmon are declining, but here's what we're doing about it. And that's how the narratives were framed, because salmon have proven that they can bounce back from these things. And what I found is that when we combine these narratives into one thing, we can transform them. So even though the sources that talked about both were still including glacier retreat, they still talked about future action at a level not seen when they were just talking about glaciers. And so we can transform these narratives, not from glaciers are retreating, we're all doomed, but we can say glaciers are retreating, it will negatively impact salmon. Here's what we can do to protect the communities that rely on the salmon themselves. And so we can actually transform narratives, which is a huge importance for science communication. And so, like I said, narratives are shaped by perspectives, relationships, and values, but they also shape perspectives on climate change. And so understanding how narratives are shaped and how to transform narratives is vital to future research. Thank you.